Bingen covers the Predators for The Athletic, and we're pleased to be joined by Adam now. The Predators lost 8 of their final 9 games, Adam, and really didn't play well the final 2 months of the year or so. What went wrong?
Oh, that's a complicated question. I was struck by something that Matt Duchene said on the locker cleanout day that the Predators had last week, and I'm paraphrasing this, but if I recall correctly, he said that perhaps the team became too focused on where they were in the standings and focusing on making the playoffs maybe a little too much or so much that they got away from the things that made them successful. And perhaps that is one reason. Certainly, they needed every point they could get down the stretch, and they were a sub 500 team after the All-Star break. But I just think that, to borrow the terrible sports cliche, they peaked at the wrong time. I think that their best play came in the middle of the season in December and January. And when the All-Star break hit in, I believe, early February, they were one of the better teams in the Western Conference. And then when they came back, they just weren't the same team. They struggled to string wins together. The defense and the goaltending that helped them get to where they were at the All-Star break faltered a little bit. So it's hard to say what. I mean, it's a loaded question, just because there are multiple things that did go wrong that ultimately led to their demise.
Getting swept in the playoffs, obviously a huge disappointment, but considering most of the experts didn't have this team in the playoffs at the beginning of the year, how should we evaluate the season as a whole, Adam?
Yeah, that's another complicated question, just because the Predators will tell you, even if you don't ask, they'll tell you that nobody expected them to do much this season, and they're right. If you were to scour all of the preseason predictions, not very many people said the Predators would make the playoffs, myself included. I predicted that they would miss the playoffs, and I was wrong about that. But it's you can look at it in one of two ways. You can look at the many individual record-breaking seasons they had. Roman Josi set the franchise single-season points record, was the first defenseman in nearly 3 decades to eclipse the 90-point mark. Matt Duchene and Philip Forsberg each scored 40 goals. The franchise, until this season, had never had a 40-goal scorer. They were the only active franchise, with the exception of the Seattle Kraken, to never have a 40-goal scorer up until this season. Tanner Jeannot led all rookies in goals with 24, I believe. UC Saros was a Vezina Trophy finalist. There was a lot to like about this season from individual standpoints. However, despite all of those things going their way, they still were the worst team to make the playoffs in the Western Conference. It took them into the final week of the regular season to make the playoffs. And once they got there, they were no match for the Colorado Avalanche. So there are reasons for optimism from an individual standpoint, but despite all of those record-breaking seasons, the Predators were unable to do anything with it. So I think it's hard to be anything but disappointed in this season, even if expectations were low, just because of how many record-breaking, as I said, career performances they got from so many players.
So how's this for a complicated question? When we highlight all those individual honors and accolades that come from this season, what has to happen to make this team go deeper into the playoffs?
Yeah, that is yet another complicated question. That when I think about it, I think when you look at the Avalanche and you look at the way their team is constructed and you look at the players at the top of their lineup, Nathan McKinnon, Gabriel Landeskog, Mikko Rantanen, Cale Makar come to mind specifically. Those players are, if we're breaking players into tiers, those are tier 1 players. Now, I understand that the reason that the Avalanche were able to acquire those players was because they were so bad for several years that they were picking at the top of the draft where all of those players were selected. The Predators do not pick at the top of the draft. The last time they had a top 5 pick was 2013, which led to Seth Jones. So when you look at the Predators' level of talent, I think we can all agree that Roman Josi is a tier 1 talent. I think UC Saros in the goaltending department is probably close to a tier 1 talent, or getting there. After that, a lot of their players are just very good. Matt Duchene, very good player. Philip Forsberg, very good player. But they're not great players. They're not elite players. And that's what this team has been missing for years. And like I said, the problem is that the Predators aren't bad enough to acquire, high-end talent in the draft. So the big question is, how are they going to go about doing it? Do they trade for somebody? Do they overpay for somebody in free agency? That's a hard question. But until they are able to acquire those types of players, in my opinion, they're probably going to be stuck in the middle, which, as you know, Steve, in sports is the worst place to be.
Yeah, that purgatory. You don't want to be there. We heard from the players this week. Now tomorrow, we'll hear from David Poile and John Hines for the final time on this season. What do you want to hear from them, Adam?
I'm more interested in hearing what David Poile has to say. I think, and I wrote about this right after the season ended. I called David Poile a, quote, unreliable narrator, which is harsh from me because I typically don't say those sorts of things. But I just have a hard time fully trusting David Poile's vision for this franchise. David Poile put his foot in his mouth last summer when he called this team's direction a competitive rebuild. It's become something of an inside joke among Predators fans, even though he tried to clarify it by calling it later on a competitive transition. I think the damage had been done. And speaking of the purgatory that you just referenced, to me, a competitive rebuild is basically GM speak for treading water. Because if you're going to enact a rebuild, undergo a rebuild, you have to take a step back. This team, didn't really take a step back to do the things that are necessary in order for them to get better. So I would really like to hear exactly what David Poile has planned for this franchise in the near future. I would like to know if he's willing to commit to actually taking a step back, even if it means missing the postseason, which this team has not done since 2014. But I think it's clear, based on what we've seen over the past few years, that this team is trending in the wrong direction. And until something drastic happens, and that might just be the team admitting that they are going to actually, like I said, to repeat myself, take a step back, an actual step back. I'm just not sure exactly where this team is going, and I think it's up to David Poile to lay it out.
Adam, in that same piece, you said not just Poile needs to talk, but it may be time for ownership to come forward and talk about their belief in the direction of the franchise right now. And judging by the mood and atmosphere around games 3 and 4, I think a lot of people in the fan base agree with you. If you could sit down Herb Fritsche, chairman of the organization, tomorrow, what would you ask him?
I would ask a lot of questions about David Poile. I would like to know what David Poile's contract situation is. I would like to know what the succession plan is for general manager, because David is 72 years old. I would like to know if the reason why the Predators have so much cap space is because they're being asked to work under an internal salary cap, so to speak. I would like to know about the finances of the organization coming out of COVID, and if making the playoffs is what is most important to them, even if it means only a couple of games of playoff revenue. I just think that it goes back to what I said about David being an unreliable narrator. The Predators ownership group has entrusted David Poile for 20 plus years to forge the path for this team. And right now, I don't see that path. I don't really understand where this franchise is going. They can call it a competitive rebuild, but as I said, I'm not really sure what that means. So I think it's important for ownership, the people who have a financial stake in the success of this franchise, to say something, because I firmly believe in the 7+ years that I've covered this team that consumer confidence in the product has never been lower than it is right now. I think, as you said, Steve, it was evident in the arena in games 3 and 4. It got loud when warranted, but it certainly was not the atmosphere that made Nashville a bucket list destination for hockey fans. And sometimes that bottom line is what gets owners' attention. So those are just a sampling of questions that I would ask ownership if given the opportunity.
Well, Adam, it is certainly going to be an interesting offseason for the Predators, and we know you will cover it every step of the way. Thanks so much for the time tonight. Good work.
Thank you, Steve.